Hello, welcome everyone to today's webcast. Everything you know about the talent supply chain is wrong. Really thrilled to be joined by my friends at Prosperix and Defiant Solutions for what will be an incredibly engaging event for the next hour. So you're all in for a treat. Essentially, traditional talent supply chain management is really based on outdated principles like supplier consolidation, optimization, rationalization, and we're really here to dispel a lot of the archaic ways that everyone is managing their talent supply chain. So hope no one gets offended at our title, right? We'd like to be progressive and thought-provoking here. So I gotta give big thanks to Sunil and our friends at Prosperix for being today's host and sponsor. Sunil, I figure you're the best guy to talk about the company you built.
Thank you, Chris. It's a pleasure to be here with you and Brian. So very excited to have this conversation. And a little bit about Prosperix. We have pioneered early on a hiring marketplace that was focused on the contingent workforce. And that marketplace today is 3,000 suppliers strong. And in addition to that, in recent years, we've launched a VMS network. It's a really end-to-end VMS technology that has all the normal bells and whistles that typical VMS platforms has, and much more. So we've developed a really thoughtful platform that helps push the boundaries on innovation for the future of work, especially the future of contingent work. And what's special about this platform is that we also have incorporated a integrated hiring marketplace into that VMS network. And what that means is that clients have the ability to access talent through a network of suppliers on day one. But that's, I think, a good summary of what we're working on. We're excited to have this conversation about the future of the talent supply chain and what that looks like. And I'm excited to have that conversation with both of you.
Great. Thanks, Sunil. So a little bit about the Future of Work Exchange. You see the logo behind me and also in front of you, but the Future of Work Exchange was birthed in mid-2021, powered by Ardent Partners, my employer, as really the premier destination for HR, talent acquisition, procurement, finance, IT execs, anything you ever wanted to know about the future of work, remote work, diversity, talent supply chain, extended workforce, AI, blockchain, open talent, the list goes on. You can find it at www.futureofworkexchange.com. And Ardent Partners, what could be said? We are a analyst, research, and advisory firm based in Boston, focused not just on talent in the future of work, but also procurement, and also the procure to pay process as well. More importantly, joined by these two esteemed gentlemen that I've known for a very, very long time. Sunil, we'll start with you, CEO of Prosperix.
Thank you again, Chris. Yeah, like I said before, Prosperix, we've been at it for about 10 years now, excited to bring the future of work and contingent workforce to kind of a new era. So very excited about that. But my background personally is technology and technology companies such as IBM, EMC, Veritas, a number of startups as well. And but I've been at this on focusing on what talent looks like, how the workforce can evolve for a number of years. And it's exciting where we're going, but also exciting how the industry is transforming in real time. So excited to be here today.
Great. This next gentleman doesn't really need much of an introduction, but you know him. He and I have not shared a stage in, it's probably been about 4 years. So it's great to be back alongside him. Good friend, Brian Pena, Principal Consultant at Defiant Solutions. Brian, welcome.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Sunil, for having me. I think Defiant Solutions, we are a research and advisory firm. We specialize in helping talent marketplaces, HR tech firms, staffing firms, and enterprises leverage future of work solutions. And then we also, through our Defiant Events and Education brand, we do sponsored webinars, trainings, workshops, and live events. And I'm fascinated about this topic. I've been in procurement myself. I sat in the seat for 12 years, in addition to researching it in my previous career as staffing industry analyst and working with major platforms and talent providers such as Prosperix. It's a really exciting time to be in this space, and I'm excited to talk about this topic.
Great. Awesome. So just some quick slides here to really set the stage. I think it's really important to talk about the state of work and talent today, right? We're talking about the talent supply chain. It's really one facet of where we are in the history of business and where we're going. But I think that these are 6 key facets really that are shaping the way that we think about work. We think about the future of work movement. We think about our talent and the many ways we're getting work done. I mean, obviously, the digital enterprise is real, digitization is real, the fact that we are moving more towards automating both tactical and strategic processes across the greater organization. And that's also factoring into the talent supply chain management as well. So many future of work accelerants. I mean, the 3 of us could literally spend the next hour just talking about the future of work, but we won't. We've got a bigger topic at hand. But think about all the wonderful accelerants that have happened over the past few years as an unfortunate byproduct of a global pandemic, whether it is the reintroduction of the hybrid work model, whether it's a refocus on diversity, equity, and inclusion, whether it is the automation of core tactical processes via AI, machine learning, or intelligent automation. Really, the future of work is not just it's not just a phrase. It's really a state of being, right? I call it a movement because that's really what it is. It's moving towards an optimized state of work, and we've seen many elements of that be accelerated over the past few years. Global disruption, really can't say too much about that. Besides, we're at the tail end of an emergency phase of a pandemic, dealing with a war overseas, economic uncertainty. Obviously, you see that up there as well, and that's really resulting in volatility across the labor market, which really makes the topic at hand so much more critical. Better managing the talent supply chain, and something I do want to bring up really quickly here is a concept called candidate centricity, right? Placing the candidates at the center of talent acquisition efforts, right? I do hate the phrase Great Resignation, but in reality, that's what it was, right? 3 to 4 million workers voluntarily leaving their jobs over the course of 14, 15, 16 months, really forced businesses to rethink the candidate experience. And so all of these factors, of course, play a big role in the state of work and talent today. We talk so much about the contingent workforce or the extended workforce as well. I've been tracking this stat for a long time, and I remember being publicly quoted back maybe about 8, 9 years ago saying that at a certain point in the future, we'd hit half of the workforce being considered extended or contingent, and we're nearing that. We're at 49% today. This is the first week that we've actually publicly revealed this stat as part of Ardent and Future of Work Exchange research. So obviously, this makes the topic again, the reimagination of the talent supply chain and talent supply chain management so much more critical when we're thinking about half of our workforce is comprised of these types of workers. So top talent challenges. I think this is an interesting series of findings here. The fact of the matter is, we're not dealing with cost or budget or the financial aspects of talent and of workforce management anymore. We're thinking more about flexibility, right? Scalability. I mean, one thing that I think of, it seems just like yesterday when the world was shutting down, right? And we went through waves. It was a roller coaster, right? Essentially of figuring out where we were going to be as businesses, how we were going to not just thrive, but actually survive in, quite uncertain times. And so workforce scalability really came to light as a critical facet of how businesses got work done, right? If we knew there was a recovery period ahead or we saw a spike in demand for products and services, well, we needed to scale our workforce up. If we hit a massive roadblock, right? Think about the big COVID waves over the past few winters. We need to scale our workforce down, right? Top challenge today, and that's not going to change anytime too soon. The skills gap. Honestly, another phrase that I hate is war for talent. There's always a war for talent. There always will be a war for talent. But if you dig into that, right, and I'm sure the gentleman here would agree with me, it really comes down to lacking skill sets. It's the skills gaps. It's the idea that we don't have the right candidates in our organization and within our talent communities in our ecosystem. And we need to do everything we can as business leaders to ensure that that competitive edge, our talent, is really reinforced with the right skill sets, the right expertise, and the right experience. I don't want to go line by line here because we've got a lot to cover, but we've got economic uncertainty affecting our talent acquisition strategies, right? A lot of businesses are worried about that today. Quiet quitting. I mean, You can't throw a rock a few feet in this industry without hitting a new phrase. Quiet quitting is amongst them, but this survey was conducted. It's still being conducted today. So these are live findings, right, over the past couple of months, still happening today. But I think you look at all these together and you think, these challenges are very different than what we've experienced in the past, which of course, I've said this a couple of times, leads us to the topic at hand. It's reimagining the talent supply chain. And so, contingent workforce management's a topic that's near and dear to my heart. Brian, you too, I know. We've covered this together for a long period of time. Really, I think that I look at these findings now and I think major shifts happening over the next month. These are expected shifts as we head into 2024, improving analytics, improving the augmentation of AI machine learning, increasing the utilization of direct sourcing. I know some of you may be sick about hearing about direct sourcing, but it's really come to light over the past few years as a viable strategy for businesses to transform their talent functions into their own internal recruitment agencies, and using that as a way, as a bridge to better, deeper talent and nurturing those talent pools and talent communities for workforce scalability and flexibility. I do want to call out one finding here, and you probably know what it is. It's the better optimization of staffing and talent suppliers, right? I mean, think about something that I call omni-channel talent acquisition, right? Omni-channel retail, right, is the fact that you as a buyer, as a consumer, have so many different channels to leverage when you buy stuff, right? Online retailer, brick and mortar locations, marketplaces, whatever it is. It's the same way for talent now. I could find talent via talent marketplace, a staffing supplier, an agency, on social media, social networks. And so the optimization of those suppliers really plays into this idea of omni-channel talent acquisition. And so, it's really, really exciting to see where the direction of extended workforce and contingent workforce management is headed over the next year, because it all points to one particular aspect, and that's talent. So we're talking about supplier optimization, right? I mean, this is a core topic for today. And I thought it was interesting to see how many enterprises really have this in place right now, right? Truly optimizing their talent supply chain, right? Only a third of companies are actually doing it today, but you see the bulk of organizations plan to implement this within the next couple of years. And so I think this adds a little bit more weight to some of the things that Sunil, Brian, and I are going to talk about today. Because again, I think that a lot of us have, quote unquote, grown up in an era where we were managing our talent supply chains in a pretty standard way. And I think the reimagination, the rebooting of those strategies is really the way to thrive and drive that workforce scalability today. So like I said, we've got about another 40 minutes or so to hit upon this panel. We've got a lot of really great questions. So I'll reintroduce our friends here, Sunil and Brian. We're going to go right in. I mean, I think that's the best way to do it here. Question number one.
Before we do that, though, I think we need to take just 1 second and call out something that is really unique to the webinars and events that Sunil and I participate on, which is calling on our beverage of choice. Nothing speaks future of work, supply chain optimization more than a quick day drinking in the morning. So just real quick, I just want to, maybe Sunil, you can talk about what you're drinking. Chris, we'll go real fast for this.
Yeah.
But I think we can't forget this fact, so people know what Sunil's.
Yeah, I've already started sipping. I'm having the Casamigos tequila in the morning, so this is my drink of choice today. Cheers to you guys.
I'm having a Campo Veda extra añejo tequila this morning. And Chris,
go the very cheap route here. I am drinking Dr. McGillicuddy's menthol mint liqueur.
There you go.
We'll take a quick
So
swig of this.
cheers to you
it's a
guys.
pleasure, everybody. Let's get started.
Cheers. How many of you have actually seen people drink on a webinar before?
Exactly.
Right.
Well, only one so far.
Yeah, once before. All right, guys. So we've got a lot to dive into here. We say talent supply chain, right? What does it mean?
Yeah, Chris, you want to define that?
I'm gonna let you guys define.
All right. So talent supply chain traditionally has meant basically the incumbent suppliers that a contingent workforce program has. So procurement typically has contracts with these incumbent suppliers. And oftentimes they're usually managed directly by the company. And if there's an MSP in place, the MSP is managing those relationships directly. The supply base can be a handful, 3, 4, 5 suppliers. And sometimes it can be a bit unruly, can get to 100 suppliers or more, right? And so that's really the supply chain typically that has been called upon to help find talent for these contingent workforce programs. Brian, any thoughts?
I think the traditional talent supply chain is predicated and based on a machine or sort of an industrial revolution, industrial age sort of notion of supplier consolidation and rationalization. And so from a procurement standpoint, most everyone on the phone has followed some form of the A.T. Kearney 7-step process. Anyone who's been in procurement can probably recite that from chapter and verse. It's based on establishment requirements and looking backwards towards determining the optimal sort of mix. Nowadays, kind of the way that we like to look at the talent supply chain is we call it the defined definition, which is really about making sure that your supply chain, instead of just limiting it to a select number of suppliers, you probably should look at your supply chain that's incorporating as many avenues to connect with individuals or connect with people as possible. You know, Chris, you mentioned at the beginning all of the myriad of ways that companies can engage talent. Just on the other side of that, talent in all of its forms has as many ways to monetize their skill as possible, through talent marketplaces, through direct sourcing engagements, through consulting engagements. Anybody with $200 can establish themselves as the business entity on LegalZoom. And so I think a lot of these new forms of working are being missed in most programs because they're relying on legacy approaches and legacy systems. So the supply chain is really predicated on kind of this notion of manufacturing, just like you know, the supply chain is whether you're buying resins to make cardboard boxes to human capital. And what we were seeing is that more and more organizations are questioning that in favor of really looking at omnichannel solutions. And that's where I think we're on the cusp of, is kind of a revolution in what it takes to get these things done.
Love that word, revolution. Been using that a lot. I think we are in the midst of a talent revolution, right? And that needs to be considered here. So before we move on to the next question, what does it mean to officially manage the talent supply chain? I know it's a loaded question.
Sam?
Yeah, managing your supply chain. So in traditional ways, first of all, you know, one of the big goals of most of these contingent workforce programs is to at least get the contract standardized, right? And what they find is that when you first set up a program, all the T's and C's, the terms and conditions of the agreements, vary from supplier to supplier. Now, if the client directly has their own standardized agreement, that's one thing, but the MSP also can establish that for these organizations. So that's the first thing that they do. The second thing they do is they look at what are the different jobs and job categories that need to be supported for that business. What are the geographies? What are the skills? And then they start to map suppliers. If they do it effectively, they map them, you know, really well, and they'll find a certain number of suppliers per category, per geography, et cetera, to come up with a rational number of how many suppliers they need based on the volumes and demand that they're expecting. And so this is an exercise that's done usually up front when you're setting up a program. And then at that same time, they'll probably set up some sort of a rate card, whether it's bill rate based, markup based, et cetera. They'll set up some sort of an assessment of, well, what are the rates we should be paying for these positions at this point in time? And so what happens is they use that kind of as their blueprint for how the program should be managed going forward from a supply-based perspective. It's a fixed number. They may even also set up some tiers. So, I have my preferred suppliers, top 10, these will be my tier 1. And then maybe, after, let's say 3-4 days, if the requirements are not being sufficiently covered by these first tier of suppliers, we'll then send them to the tier 2 suppliers, et cetera, et cetera. And they come up with some sort of rationality, some sort of logic for how this should operate. And it becomes their blueprint, standard operating procedures. So that's traditionally how it's managed, at least that I've seen. And there's pros and cons to a lot of these approaches. And I think that we're going to dig into that in a few moments.
Cool. Let's move on here. So again, another dual part, very loaded question. What does a talent supply chain look like for most companies today? I'll kick this one off, right? We talked about the omni-channel experience, right? The fact that businesses aren't just relying on staffing suppliers for the bulk of their extended or contingent workforce, right? They're dealing with talent pools, both public and private, talent marketplaces, digital staffing outlets, freelancer networks, social networks, right? I mean, really the mix of talent sources today is just growing faster than ever. I mean, it looks so much different than it did years ago, right? I'm sure you guys would agree.
Yes, absolutely.
Absolutely.
Cool. Let me dive into that a little bit.
I think one of the things to talk about today, most companies, while you reference a lot of these really forward-thinking channels, I think they're really used in spot solutions with most major enterprises. I think that a lot of companies really look at their program and it's really heavily weighted towards traditional supplier staffing, where the notion of leverage rules the day. Fewer is better, fewer, more aggressively negotiated programs with fewer suppliers that you can then leverage transparency and get cost effectiveness on that, which is nothing entirely wrong with that traditionally, but it really misses out on the speed with which requirements change. And it's also based on snapshots in time. So instead of being able to be responsive to the needs of the business in real time and being a true strategic resource, what we see is a lot of companies who have these sort of legacy approaches to supply chain management struggle to keep their programs from shrinking over time, much less growing, right? And so as you see that, you're constantly trying to rejigger the mix. So what we try and really recommend clients do is look at the universe of talent as more like a river than a pool. I use a metaphor as a river, like a lake, a talent lake versus the talent river. A talent lake, you have very defined requirements and you stock that lake and you control access to that lake and you decide what kind of fish go into the lake, how it's sourced, and live in the number of boats, all those other things that fit with the metaphor. The talent sort of supply chain of the future is more of like a river, and you want to be able to dip into that river of knowledge and skills in real time and have as many possible lines into that river as you can. So the future and effective programs that we're going to start seeing more and more of is going to really focus on building as many access points into that river of talents as possible. Because people are going to want to work a multitude of ways, and they're not necessarily going to want to go through the traditional agency process. It stands to reason that the most skilled individuals, the highest value talent, are going to want to work for themselves, leveraging one of the many platforms that they have available to them. So limiting your approach to a select number of suppliers really kind of limits your access to that high skill, high demand talent. And the notion of a supply chain and the notion of the way you approach human capital should be to how do you leverage that human capital access to create a competitive advantage. We can talk about cost savings, we can talk about process efficiencies, saving time, all that other stuff. But at the end of the day, the true goal of your program, the most mature programs, truly deliver a competitive advantage in the access to talent. And the only way that you're going to do a competitive advantage is not looking backwards towards traditional supply chain modalities, but really trying to effectively build as many connection points into your program as possible to accept and access talent in all of its forms in the myriad of ways that people are going to want to work. So I think that's a truly, I think, an interesting development over time, and one that a lot of organizations have struggled to implement strategically. I think that most organizations, for example, use talent marketplaces as point solutions within their given departments because they know so-and-so, or they know X, Y, or Z, or the traditional chain doesn't deliver those results. But we don't see a whole lot of companies leveraging that in a strategic manner. And they're still trying to figure out how to implement those solutions alongside traditional modes of engagement. So I think the talent supply chain of the future is really going to have a lot of these new technologies in there. And really what the elements are, the problem is yet to be solved how to do that at scale. And I think that's an interesting development. When that's figured out, I think we'll see a revolution. Again, I love that word revolution, and how these things are leveraged and managed moving forward.
Sunil?
And I'll add to that, like, what we should think about is, why do we need a supply chain in the first place? Like, what are we trying to solve, right? And as Brian said, it's really about access to talent. Many of these businesses, when they set up a program, their number one goal is to make sure that they can fulfill all their positions that are open from a contingent perspective, right? And usually what they realize over a period of time is that the talent supply chain sometimes is not able to deliver, right? And why is that? Well, because when you first evaluate a supplier, they may look great on paper, they may be able to deliver great results, but remember, these are dynamic organizations. Every supplier is changing regularly. I've heard so many stories about, the best recruiters leaving a staffing supplier, right? And going somewhere else. Well, guess what? If they're not supporting your business anymore, then how are you going to guarantee that you get the same results? The other challenge that we have is that we do QBRs, or, quarterly business reviews, quarterly. We do scorecard reviews quarterly. How do you know if the performance of your supply chain is not performing, right? And so how do you know in advance or predictably, so that you can make changes appropriately so that it doesn't affect your ability to hire? And then there are other aspects like compliance. A lot of businesses really suffer a lot when you have suppliers going around the program, right? And doing SOWs instead, and that drives up cost, it drives up risk, et cetera. And so, when you look at that, have you designed your supply chain to be agile? Have you designed it to be resilient? Have you designed it to be, work in a fashion where, suppliers feel like they're part of an ecosystem that is constantly evolving and they have something reasonable to work for, right? So there's a lot of facets to think about, but the end goal is making sure the supply chain delivers the talent that you need. And if it doesn't, it likely has to do with how you've structured it.
So you bring up a really good point, Sunil. I'm sorry, Chris.
No, it's okay.
A good point, which is your supply chain getting you the talent that you need? So often, and this goes back to a philosophical point. I know a great number of very experienced program managers who kind of forget that that's the goal of the program, right? That it's about getting the right person in the right role at the right time for the right cost with the right level of risk. It's not about generating cost savings. It's not about furthering your program growth. It's not about those other things. Those things are consequences of it. And I think that forgetting the purpose of why we do what we do is at the root of a lot of dysfunction in many programs that struggle to grow. And if you start with the fundamental purpose, every project charter in the world should start with a mission statement or a project purpose. This field is no different. And if the purpose is not about cut costs, I'm saying that's the viable outcome. But it should be about making sure that all of your strategic resources and people within your organization have the ability to get the right person when it's necessary and when it's needed. So that's also a good point, and something that people often forget in favor of the goal of reducing costs and slamming margins and squeezing suppliers and looking at pay rates. Those things are all often tactics that are required given each corporate separate situation. But really, the purpose of every program should be to have an excellent experience for your end users, excellent experience for your clients, and make sure that you become an employer or a destination of choice and that they work for you and not the competition. And so looking at this in the traditional metrics, sometimes that's missed because it's focused on legacy perspectives that were perfectly appropriate 10, 20 years ago, back when you were consolidating 1,000 suppliers with very little technical oversight. Technology nowadays allows you to engage thousands of suppliers with real controls and real metrics and measurement. And so that's the sort of thing that I think is really exciting, is being able to leverage these newer models like the crowd within programs to deliver outcomes that heretofore have just been completely unavailable or lack the ability to truly deliver differentiation. So I just always want to make sure that we bring out that point that the purpose of a program is to have the right people show up and create excellent experience for everyone overall.
Good points, gentlemen. So the second part of the question here is about what are organizations missing out on without truly optimizing their talent supply chains. And so, Brian, you bring up a good point about some of the traditional aspects. So lack of transparency, cost overruns, poor communication, overworked, underperforming suppliers. How are those elements playing into sort of this next gen talent supply chain?
Oh, I think the biggest thing for that is this notion of program adoption and growth. I talk to, on average, 15 to 20 different enterprise program managers a week. And historically speaking, they're all struggling with the same questions, which are program adoption, program growth. They're seeing compliance slip, they're seeing their spend go down, not just because spend is going down, but they're creating negative experiences for their hiring managers. And what that does is it impedes program growth and also supplier prioritization. You know, a lot of suppliers definitely don't choose to work within MSPs, or they're seeing downward performance within their programs within the traditional paradigm. And so some of the consequences for that are really suffering levels of adoption, and poor adoption is the death of any program. If your program's not growing, or at minimum staying the same, you're really missing out on a lot of the newer modes of engagement. And so as program adoption goes down, which it inherently does over time, for a lot of folks, you're going to start not achieving the same goals. Your risk level is going to increase, your costs are inherently going to increase, and your ability to protect your company from peaks and valleys in demand and be the agile workforce that Sunil mentioned are going to be limited. So
Brian,
supply chain management is based on the wrong principles, which are, you know, some legacy principles whose time has gone and gone.
Mm-hmm.
Brian, what's the difference between supplier optimization versus rationalization? I never could figure that out.
Well, I think they're kind of the same thing. I think supplier I think they're kind of the same thing in most. There's kind of like interchangeable. I think ostensibly supplier optimization speak to the notion of creating an optimal experience for your suppliers and looking at making more of a partnership strategically, as opposed to rationalization, which is, you know, really geared towards reducing your supply base. Sometimes they're used, you know, colloquially interchangeably, but the way I look at optimization is really more about optimizing the supplier partnership, and really much more importantly, creating an optimal experience as a client. I use the saying that if you want the best suppliers, want the best pricing, be the best client. So supplier optimization really starts with looking at yourself as an enterprise client and determining, how do I add cost or inefficiencies into the process, and what can I do, and what's required to be able to become the best possible client partner for suppliers to work with. That sometimes does not go hand in hand with rationalization.
Yep. So let's say a client says they have 15 suppliers and they've optimized to those top 15. How do they know that they have the best suppliers?
I think that, well, that's indeed the question of the day, right? How do you know? I mean, how do you know the best? I think that they use traditional metrics of KPIs and QBRs to monitor and manage their performance. And usually the sad fact is I always use the phone ringing metaphor. I know the suppliers are optimal because no one's complaining, right? So the absence of noise is often a key metric that a lot of folks just think, okay, well, no one's complaining to me, so but everything's going well. Yep. And then they have their periodic QBRs with their partners, and they look at the numbers and they determine what a good supplier is looking like based on some backwards facing number of control, number of submittal placements, errors and omissions, escalation points, things that are usually included in KPI. But that's all looking backwards, not looking forwards, and most of us, and more importantly, not looking at what's happening in real time.
Yep. So I want to, so let's put a pin in the QBR conversation, because we're going to revisit that soon. Well, last point here, we're going to launch a quick poll right after we mentioned this point. Talked about the growth of the extended workforce, right? You know, we're nearing half. I mean, might as well be there at 49% according to research. How much does that change the makeup of supplier optimization, right? How does that shift our thinking? We're not talking about a third of our workforce anymore. We're not talking about 40% of our workforce anymore. We're talking about half of our workforce. I mean, shouldn't that be the wake-up call for businesses to think, hey, I don't just have the need to better manage my suppliers, but I need to expand those suppliers, right? Brian, you had that river analogy, right? Lake river analogy. You know, direct sourcing, talent marketplaces, freelancer networks, expert networks too, right? So many different sources. I mean, the fact that we're at that point where half of the workforce is considered extended contingent, doesn't that really change the game?
Yep.
I mean, you actually would think so. I think that as people choose to work independently, which is something we're going to see more of with a lot of, with economic cycles like this, it tends to increase overall usage over time because people choose to work independently either by choice. We call them reluctant independents, or not reluctant independents, but people who choose to work by choice, and recognizing that there are many ways to monetize their experience. They're just going to have to. They're forced to look at those channels because eventually people are going to really choose to work this particular way, having several clients that they can rely on, as opposed to just working for one company where they're putting all their eggs in one basket. There's data that shows that people who choose to work on a contingent basis feel happy on almost every single dimension. In terms of job satisfactory, job security, they feel they can control their destiny, their work-life balance. As those numbers increase and it becomes viable to be an individual, and with the rise of AI and ChatGPT and the myriad of ways in which you can punch above your weight as an individual, more and more people are going to choose to work this way. And the people who are truly the best at what they do are going to do that. So as organizations, you have to recognize that that's a viable way to do that. In a lot of cultures, a lot of countries, it's historically been sort of like poo-poo. People assume that if you're an independent contractor, you're there because you can't find a job. And I think what's happened over the last several years is it's no longer that way. It's no longer that way that the code for being a freelancer is unemployed. It's it's an accepted way to work. If we simply take that on, and we do, I mean, you'll see, we used to have leadership meetings with CEOs of all the major staffing firms and MSPs back in one of my previous roles at staffing industry analyst. And the comment was always, we know that this industry will have arrived. We're on the front of the Harvard Business Review. Well, that's happened dozens and dozens of times. And it's impossible to not type in, for future of work or gig work or independent freelancers or what have you, and not see the press and the interest and the like, and the professionalization of the role of managing this disparate field. So I think that organizations are going to have to really do this as we come out of whatever this recession, based on what people say, it's going to be, it's going to be a transformative time, and it's going to create a whole host of HR related challenges for organizations moving future around how you determine what a culture is, what's the organization about. Those sorts of things are things that need to be resolved as you get to a tipping point where more than 50% of some organizations are non-employees. There are some organizations that have, I remember working with a client many, many years ago who had like 75% of their employees were independent contractors or freelancers. Well, that's a whole separate management paradigm, and that's a whole separate way to manage organization. And a lot of companies don't do that. And I think that we're going to see, as we see increased professionalization of the role that includes non-employees, these newer ways to engage will just increase dramatically.
Yep. I'll add one thing, which is, when the contingent workforce maybe was 10 or 20% adoption, then you could say it's ancillary work, right? Just supplemental. But when it's at 50%, it represents a core part of the work that needs to get done. So these are not just any longer supplemental. Sometimes they are, but many of them are really driving core aspects of the business. And that means that how the treatment of these individuals, the treatment of that contingent workforce needs to be rethought, right? Just are they really, as many people will say, they're second-class citizens, right? And they're treated differently oftentimes. The badge they receive, what events they can attend, et cetera, right? And so going forward, I think there's going to be a shift into recognizing that they're playing a critical role and they're essential to the business, and the treatment of that will have to change in a meaningful way.
Now, Brian, you say the contingent workers are happier, right? What about those who analyze the contingent workforce? Are they happier too, or no?
Could you repeat that one more time? I'm so sorry, the last part of your question.
I said those who analyze the contingent workforce, are they happier too?
I like to think so.
Yeah,
I like to think so. We've been doing this now for 25 years, so I feel like we've always been historically ahead of the curve to be focusing on this as a viable channel. I think that if we look back, back when we developed the CCWP certification, that was the recognition of the professionalization of the role of managing contingent work. One of the things that's an interesting development over the last couple of years specifically, and Sunil and I talked about this just the other day, is that there's a host of people who go right into the role, right? A lot of people who manage contingent work, I always kind of make a joke that we're all gypsies. No one graduates college and says, I'm going to be a contingent workforce program manager. Now we have people graduating college and this is their first job. Now that's a great sort of validation that it's a viable career path and a viable skill and a viable place to start your career. But that also creates a lot of challenges because they're stepping into that role and they've never implemented a program in real time. So that creates a lot of challenges for a lot of providers as they implement and deploy these new solutions, because sometimes the requirements gathering process is not quite as tight as it could be. So it creates a lot of opportunity for partnership and recognition of suppliers to really put their stake in the ground and say, these are the ways that things need to be done. And looking to work in a more collaborative sense as opposed to dictatorial is something that we might have seen back when the programs were being deployed in the early 2000s.
Great. I think we're going to skip the flow and just head to the next questions here. Good discussion. That's a mark of a good panel, right? The fact that we're going so fast. I think we've kind of handled this question here. What's impacting the talent supply chain? Why isn't it getting better? We think we've tackled a lot of those gaps. Anything else to add here? Should probably move on.
Yeah, I'll add a couple things. So one is, right now businesses are taking not enough of a data-driven approach that is perhaps on real-time data, right? If you think about it, a supplier gets into a program based on relationships, based on just how slick their marketing is or how great the salesperson is, et cetera. And then they're asked to prove themselves over time, but that data to see how well they're performing doesn't come into till a quarter later and when the scorecards come in. So more of a real-time kind of having a pulse on that supply chain, I think is essential, data-driven approach. And then, there's other reasons why it's not getting better, because there's a thought that having fewer suppliers is better. That mindset, that shift needs to happen really with that mindset of less is more, which by the way, in most aspects of my life, I do agree, less is more. And yet what we're finding in the talent supply chain is sometimes more is more, right? You don't know which suppliers actually are good until you bring them in, right? You don't know if they're going to outperform the ones that you have. You don't know if they're going to be not only providing better quality, but perhaps less, costs as well. And so it's an, opportunity to really rethink, how does the supply chain get managed? What suppliers are asked to join, and how you can take a data-driven approach to essentially make sure that they're the right ones at all times. And it's kind of like in manufacturing, there's a concept called just-in-time manufacturing. In this case, we're kind of really thinking about just-in-time talent. So the right suppliers are really providing the right talent at the right moment, right when you need it. And therefore, it's kind of responsive. It's agile from that approach perspective. I also like to think about it and equate it to like how Uber's transformed rideshare, right? It used to be that you'd call a taxi stand and get them to send a driver to help take you. Well, now Uber's managing all of that. They're looking at all rides that are coming in, using data to then match them to all drivers that are perhaps going in a similar direction as the rider. All of the algorithms work in real time to really do that kind of intelligent matching from rider to driver, to make efficiencies, to optimize what's needed, to optimize the experience, et cetera, and also drive down cost savings, right? And so that's the idea here of how do we revolutionize, how do we modernize this supply chain so that it can be as responsive as an Uber ride?
Great. Let's move on. Let's walk through the typical supplier experience: application, onboarding, up to exiting a program.
Yeah, it's a fun one. I know that from my own experience, we've had plenty of opportunities to get, added to programs. But what's interesting about that, and Chris, I don't know if you have some of those emails or not, but there's often you send an email to a program manager as a supplier, and the response is, so glad that you sent an email, thank you. And yet we're optimizing, we're rationalizing, we're not going to be adding a supplier for a long time. We'll let you know when we do. And it really becomes kind of a black box. You never hear from them again, right? And that's the typical, way suppliers kind of deal with programs. And usually what they end up having to do is, because they know that they're going to get a gatekeeper, they usually find ways to get around the contingent workforce program. They try to get the attention of the manager and say, hey, I've got a great resume here. Take a look at this candidate. And the manager, if they give them attention, will try to perhaps get them added to a program. Or they find a different way avenue in, which is they'll go through an SOW and say, hey, we can provide resources, time and material, but under an SOW, which should be maybe deliverables based. And so they're going to find ways into a program. But the reason they basically do that is because they always are told, no, you can't join the program, or they never hear from the contingent workforce program management team. And so that becomes a big challenge. And from a supplier perspective, and I know from our, the experience that we've had, it's frustrating. It's really challenging, right? What they want to do is partner. They want to provide great talent. And what they're all constantly being told is no, right? That we don't need you, or for a variety of reasons that we're not doing that. So there you go. There's some emails there. And none of them are friendly, right? And they don't make you feel empowered, right? Those kind of emails. And that's, I don't know, it's the kind of experience that honestly, I feel like it needs to evolve. It needs to change, and soon, because you're not really thinking from a customer support perspective or supplier partnership perspective, right? How do you create the best experience for your suppliers who are critical to helping provide the best talent for your business, right? And so on.
Yeah, and I'd add too that this is really the antithesis of what we would call candidate centricity, right? Like the idea that we need to be more talent led. Our program should be more talent led. It's about the candidate experience and the hiring manager experience as well. The fact that, Sunil, you put it best, right? Are your suppliers, are your channels getting the best possible talent into your organization? This literally flies in the face of that.
Yeah. And by the way, these are real emails, right? Like, I can't tell you which companies they're from because I don't know, it would be embarrassing for those companies. But one's from an MSP and the other's from a client, right? That business. So these are real emails that go out to suppliers, and this is what they face all the time, right? And it's not supplier friendly from my perspective.
Well, I think one of the things that we would be remiss in pointing out when we talk about that, one, you're 100% right, Sunil. It's very, very difficult for suppliers to penetrate and find new opportunities within programs. And the reason why that's so difficult is because, sitting in the seat for 12 years, I can tell you I would get hundreds of emails a day and dozens of phone calls in a week. And so it just, at some point, it becomes almost difficult, really very difficult to manage. And the only answer that you can have is waiting back, we'll get back to you when you can. And historically, what's driven people away from changing that paradigm is only one of two things, which is pain or scarcity. Something's gone wrong, so they need to reassess their supply chain, which means that the problems have been created and you're dealing with a problem. Instead of being proactive, you're being reactive. And traditional supply chain management is by its very nature reactive. And so, that's why you see these emails, is because as an individual, as a program office manager, as a contingent workforce manager, it's just impossible to be able to respond to every single request or every single supplier who wants to participate, because it's the age old sort of like, why do people rob banks? Is because that's where the money is. In enterprise and programs, that's why they continue to reach out to the program managers, is because that's where the enterprise gatekeeper has always been. And some of the core sort of functions of traditional contingent workforce management within the role is to minimize the number of suppliers who interact with their hiring managers. Back when, I think, with my very first program, we had literally 1,000 workers and probably several hundred different suppliers. That's incredibly difficult to manage using historical technology. And when there is really, nothing in place, Wild West is obviously we've all called it. And so then now newer technologies are enabling that to be done easily and at scale. Mental note, turn off my phone. Oh, sorry about that.
Oh, all good. That's we're running short on time, so I'm going to move over to the next question here. I guess to sum this up, what is the best process for supplier performance management, supplier relationship management, and guaranteeing those hiring results?
Yeah. And this is where we're very excited, because we've really thought long and hard. In fact, it's one of the questions that just came up as well is how can companies build a more agile and flexible talent supply chain, right? That can adapt to business needs and workforce dynamics. So what I'll say is the way to do that is, first of all, you have to think real time, right? And so the data has to be available where you're assessing suppliers in real time. So for example, the first thing that we get is suppliers create a profile. So we know based on their profile what they say they're good at. And usually we find those to be aspirational capabilities, right? They say they're good at everything, actually. And then what happens is when they get into a platform, a VMS in the hiring marketplace, et cetera, they're actually starting to save jobs. Sometimes they say they're good at IT, but they're saving finance jobs. Well, guess what? If you have an AI or ML algorithms that are learning from that data, they're seeing what data, that what actual interaction the suppliers are having in real time. The third thing is their performance. So if they're constantly performing really well at client X on certain positions for example, software engineering, then guess what? The algorithms learn that. And then they'll serve up more positions, recommendations for the suppliers in real time that basically match what they're good at based on interviews that they're getting, hires that they're getting, their scorecard results, et cetera. Another aspect is, so you're assessing all their performance. Another aspect is you're providing their scorecard in real time. So the suppliers can self-manage. If they're not great on quality, they can improve that quality because they can see that in real time. The client can see that in real time as well, right? The MSP can see this in real time. So you're not waiting for 3 months, 6 months later, where you have stale data and can't really affect it, but you're actually doing this decisioning in real time. And then that data feeds algorithms to make better matching and happen in real time again. That's how you guarantee great results. So what we've seen in some of the clients that we've adopted this is that we get 100% coverage on placements, right? On positions that are open. So that means that every job gets supplied by talent in the ecosystem through the supplier program. Why? Because you don't have to worry about adding more suppliers. The suppliers are always saying in the ecosystem, they're in the marketplace, they're constantly being told, yes, you can join. And they're not just joining a single program, they're joining, dozens and dozens of programs simultaneously. And they're self-selecting what they're good at, which clients they want to support, which job categories. And then if they're good at certain ones, we're making recommendations on other ones in real time. So that gives you a supplier that's hungry and motivated, that's not being told no, and a gatekeeper's keeping them away, and a client that's getting the right results from getting all positions served and filled. And then what we also learn is that when you have more options, you get better coverage on skills, on geography, and you get cost savings because you're driving in competition, right? Healthy competition. And so that provides the best outcomes for these businesses.
And that's a great point, Sunil. And I think one thing just to point out is I was talking to a provider yesterday. I think making sure that you have a deep understanding of exactly letting suppliers play where their strengths are. And many programs measure things like submittal ratio. And what that creates is negative incentives for the wrong suppliers to submit roles because they don't want their submittal rates to go down. If it's not the right role, they penalize them for low submission rates, as opposed to really making sure that you allow those providers to compete for those roles that they feel they can best deliver, where they have a certain level of candidate density and perspective. Traditional supplier management doesn't allow for that. If you rationalize your supply base, you really penalize your suppliers for not submitting to given requisitions. If they're not competitive for that role, why on earth would you drive them to respond just to check a box on a QBR and drive their overall metrics down? So recognizing that sometimes supplier realization is at odds with the ways that we currently measure success is one way to look at kind of changing your program and taking that as a first step.
All right, spirit of time, only a few minutes left here. I want to get to the last two questions. We put a pin in this one. Now it's time to dig a little bit more into it. The QBR, is the QBR dead? Should it be dead? Should it be reimagined? Why is it?
Yeah, in our experience, we still do QBRs with our clients and suppliers more as a checkpoint on a quarterly basis on strategic discussions and conversations, and less about performance, because performance is transparent and available to them all the time in real time, right? So they don't have to kind of wonder how well they're doing. It's more about, hey, where's the program going and how can we create a better partnership that is more meaningful on other facets rather than just the performance elements, which is a QBR or scorecards are typically geared around, right?
I think QBRs are required because, to your point, checkpoint, but also I think what they focus on needs to be different. Obviously looking backwards, I always use the kind of comment, if you have a QBR and everything's green, then why waste everybody's time? It should be a focus on what are you going to do differently, and specifically something that I really hope more and more organizations take on is how are we going to bring innovation into the program? I think that is a missed topic in so many ways where you're driving some of the new forms of adoption, as opposed to just ensuring that you're managing markup and managing bill rates or looking at your fill rates. Those are all great things to track. But I think to Sunil's point, it's too late by the time you're at the QBR. And so looking at those things in real time at the closest point to affect decision-making and be able to provide impact is super important, but also making sure that those QBRs are on focusing not just what's happened backwards, but what you're going to do differently moving forward from a supplier management or from a program management standpoint.
It's a good point, Brian. I mean, I would add to that, especially in the economic business climate that we're in right now. It would be good to know, what are you going to do for me for the next 3 months, 6 months, 9 months? Economic uncertainty, how am I going to be more scalable? How are you going to contribute to that? Love the idea of innovation there. All right, last question, and of course, it's probably the most loaded, wordy one. But given all we've talked about today, even think about things like globalization and some of the challenges. How do companies, take it all in? How do they shift their thinking in regards to talent supply chain management?
Yeah, it's a very important question. And, as I've stated with Brian in our past webinar, where we talked about exponential shifts in the world, if the world around you is changing exponentially, then you have to have solutions that are also designed exponentially so that they can handle that change, be resilient, be agile, and really apply a different method of innovation. In case of Prosperix, we've developed what's called a VMS network that has a fully integrated hiring marketplace, which means that you never have to go outside the ecosystem to access talent. You can leverage your incumbent supply base. You can leverage a network of suppliers at 3,000 plus strong that are diverse. So you have niche suppliers, boutique suppliers, large companies, large staff, international, independent recruiters. I mean, and that kind of diversity allows you to fulfill positions in real time using AI, algorithms, real-time scorecards, et cetera. That's how you rethink the talent supply chain, and allows you to kind of really become, have a pulse on how the business is evolving, and therefore you can become agile. You can essentially shift as the business is shifting, and be able to adapt to that change that's happening in real time.
I think Sunil said it exactly right. I think the one thing I would add is to be much more open to new modes of technology. I think question, what just because something worked in the past doesn't mean it's going to be the best suited for the future. And I think, recognize that technology is at a place now where the protective controls that we used to require allow you to do much more and more effectively than in the past. So a lot of the control theory around how you manage your suppliers is frankly no longer super relevant given today's paradigm. And you really should be thinking about making sure they create the best possible climate, both for your supplier partners and for the candidates they accept to work with your organization. And if you start with those fundamental principles, it'll make a whole hell of a difference.
Good note to go out on. We're right at the hour here. I want to thank everyone for being a part of this this exclusive fun webcast. I want to thank true friends here, Brian and Sunil, for drinking and talking today. It's
cheers, guys.
Thanks to Defiant and Prosperix for helping us out here today, and of course, thank you all for attending. Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Brian.